All right, it's time. Let's get started. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to our early afternoon session of the Fulbright Forum. Yes, welcome to those of you who are joining us now for the first time, and welcome back to those of you who were with us this morning. In the first part of our program this morning, we heard from 4 excellent Fulbright Fellows in diverse fields: language, engineering, seaweed, aquaculture, and environmental studies. And we're going to continue now with 3 of our Fulbright National Science Foundation Arctic Fellows and scholars who are going to present in the second session of the day. And I just want to note also that these speakers exemplify Fulbright Iceland's commitment to advancing young scholars, right? Making and helping them to sort of, at the beginning of their academic careers and to further their scholarship and make important contributions that will hopefully last a lifetime. The first speaker this afternoon is Robyn Barrow, a PhD candidate in medieval art at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been working on her dissertation hosted by the Árni Magnússon Institute. And I know that Robyn has also used this opportunity to engage with Icelandic scholars and build relationships. So Robyn, please tell us all about how your Fulbright year has gone. Oh, yeah, is that, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, so to advance the slide, I just go down, hit down. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to first just express my deepest gratitude for the Fulbright Commission here in Iceland, as well as my in-country advisor, Steinunn Kristjánsdóttir, for the guidance and support. I'm excited to share with you today a brief overview of the work I've done during my Fulbright. It's been an incredibly generative year, and my time in Iceland has been marked by many experiences that I will treasure all of my life. So, takk fyrir. During my time living in Reykjavik, I've gained intimate knowledge of Iceland's culture, climate, and landscape. I've conducted extensive field work across the island, visiting regional sites and museums to build my knowledge of the medieval corpus of Icelandic objects, as well as study how Icelanders adapted their architecture and lifestyles to accommodate to accommodate resource, especially timber scarcity. I also did archival work at the offsite storage at the National Museum of Iceland and conducted research at length at Arnastofnan. In addition, I met with major scholars in archaeology and art history at the university, including Margaret Cormack, who has joined us today, building my professional network and gaining interlocutors for my research project. So with the gains made in these endeavors, I drafted the 3rd chapter of my dissertation, which is entitled Olaf's Axe, Wood Carving and Structures of Power in Medieval Iceland and Norway. This chapter argues that power dynamics and settlement economics between medieval Norway and Iceland can be understood through an investigation of Norwegian forestry law, resource management, and timber scarcity on Iceland. And the chapter explores the ways this economic exchange was mediated by the powerful cult of St. Olav, the martyred perpetual king of Norway. So my chapter was accepted by my academic advisor, and it was also successfully received at my departmental colloquium on March 4, 2022, a major rite of passage in my doctoral program. I also presented at 3 other conferences, 2 of them remotely, to receive feedback and expand my academic network, including at the panel I co-organized for the annual 2022 meeting of the Medieval Academy of America in Charlottesville. So, this is me on a horse. So with that brief summation of my activities, I would now like to just toss you in for a very abbreviated overview of the research that I completed with the Fulbright support. So the 12th century Ufsir Christ, which once hung in a church in the fertile valley of Svarfaðardalur in North Iceland, is the oldest surviving sculpture carved for a church in Iceland. The living crowned figure looks down with a serene gaze, his long coiled hair, dapper mustache, and beard elegantly arranged. The body is long and slender, with very thin outstretched arms and fragmented hands, broken off around the points where the nails through the palms connected the corpus to the cross. The fragile body does not widen at all to accommodate the disproportionately sized head, accentuating the regal composition of the face as Christ calmly meets the eyes of those who stand below him. The arms, individually joined to each side of the torso, are dramatically thin, like the emaciated body itself, abstracted like the sharp peaks of the collarbones and stylized dips of the exposed sternum. This sculpture, the oldest known Icelandic work of church art, is also one of the few medieval wooden objects carved from Iceland's rare native trees, downy birch, or birki. On Iceland, the climate and scant soil result in shrub-sized trees, and only in the sheltered inland valleys does downy birch forest grow to a maximum size of 15 meters in height. Adapting to the extremely high winds, Icelandic birch trees tend to twist and bend, their trunks rarely reaching the maximum species diameter of around 28 centimeters. When Iceland was first occupied by Norse settlers around 870, birch woodland, some of it protected valley forests of significant height, but much of it a scrubby tangle around waist high, covered approximately 25 to 40% of the island. By the 20th century, this birch coverage had decreased to a historic minimum of less than 1% of the island. There was an extremely limited number of trees that grew to a size, height, and straightness to be an adequate source for lumber, suitable either for carving or building. Thus, Icelanders had to rely on other sources for their bulk of their timber. This makes the birch Ufsir Christ a significant witness to an artist working within the affordances of the locally grown wood for carving works of art. The proportions of the Ufsir Christ, the thin arms, and consistency across the width of the head and torso of the figure give the corpus rather non-anatomical proportions, but record a careful, if rather awkward, design that makes use of as much of the slender birch trunk and its limbs as possible. The proportions of the body showcase the carver working within the bounded affordances of Icelandic birch in a way that forefronts the regal gaze of Christ, the emaciated and tortured body of the crucified God. Scarcity informs. Icelanders developed numerous coping strategies to work around the lack of native timber resources. Most significant is the use of turf construction for both home complexes and churches from at least the 11th century and very likely earlier. The unique construction technologies tailored to the specific landscape of Iceland, utilized from quite early in Icelandic settlement, provided sturdier structures which allowed inhabitants to cope with the island's weather conditions, particularly the intense gusts of wind, which I know we've all experienced. Yet despite the potential drawbacks of building churches from wood on Iceland, and the fact that none survive here from the Middle Ages, we know that many timber churches were nevertheless built, including 2 monumental cathedrals. At 50 meters long, 12 meters wide, and 14 meters high, the medieval cathedral at Skálholt, the seat of the bishop in southern Iceland, was regarded as the largest wooden church in the whole of the medieval Nordic world. To achieve such feats, medieval Icelanders had to acquire wood grown beyond its shores. Though driftwood was a major source of timber, which I investigate extensively in my chapter, in this brief talk, I only have time to discuss imported Norwegian pine. One of the major textual monuments of Commonwealth-era Iceland, and paramount for legal historians, are the Grögos, the oral law codes first recited at the Alþingi. These laws give keen insights into legal administration within Iceland during the Commonwealth period. Key among them is the Olavslög, or Olav's Law, a treaty traditionally believed to have been negotiated between King Olav Haraldsson, the Norwegian king who became St. Olav, and the Icelanders during his reign in the 11th century. This series of agreements relate to the rights of Icelanders when in Norway and the rights of the King of Norway in Iceland. In the Olavslög, Icelanders are promised access to unlimited building grade timber from the King's Forest in Norway. Quote, Icelanders have the right to make use of water and wood in Norway, but they have the right to cut all the wood they want only where the forest belongs to the king. It demonstrates an ostentatious gift of excess. Only a kingdom so wealthy in forests could afford to be so open-handed with this resource. St. Olav, characterized in his veneration at Nidaros as the great fruit-bearing tree of the Norwegian church, is in law codes manifested by trees, his power now literally linked to timber access for Iceland. The Olavslög encouraged a Norwegian monopoly upon timber imported by Iceland, a significant factor in Norway's increasing control of all trade in and out of Iceland. Through the 12th and 13th centuries, goods which reached Iceland arrived on Norwegian ships, and Icelandic access to other external markets disappeared. Meanwhile, the protections granted to Norwegian traders in Iceland promoted their presence on the island, providing greater accessibility to traded staples, such as wood and grain sourced from Norway. Having no minted currency, the key good which Icelanders had to trade for foreign resources was vavmal, a woolen cloth produced locally. In order to achieve economic prominence on the island, landowners had to be able to pasture a large number of sheep to produce wool to produce this cloth. This thereby encouraged land clearing, the removal of any large vegetation such as bush-sized trees to accommodate ever greater sheep herds, and the sheep would also nibble away at them, so deforestation. In this way, the Olavslög provided both more convenient and singular access to Norwegian timber for Icelanders, while at the same time contributing to the economic structures which propelled the deforestation of the island's own limited native trees. The trade monopolies encouraged by the agreements made in the Olavslög would contribute to increasing Icelandic dependence on Norway for essential goods until the end of the Commonwealth era in 1262, when Iceland was officially brought under Norwegian rule. Of the wooden objects that exist from the medieval period in Iceland, nearly all of them are now housed in a single exhibition space in the National Museum of Iceland. These are chance survivors, rescued from the natural life cycle of Icelandic timber. Churches which blew down or monasteries that were closed were stripped of their timber and carvings, the material redistributed for other purposes. Carved or painted wooden boards that within the church contributed to the ornament and meaning of the sanctified space re-entered a system of material necessity. In its central position in the museum, the Valjóstaðardoor commands the space both in its sheer size and the bold storytelling of its roundels. In comparison to its compatriots in the exhibition, the 3 planks of pine that make up the door are massive and incredibly thick. The carving is deep and coherent, and the object exists in a state that at least feels very complete, a satisfying monolith in a museum of medieval fragments. The iconography of the Valjóstaðardoor speaks to human victory over natural forces. The lower roundel is an undulating mass of forms as 4 interlocking dragons seize one another by the throats. Claws, tails, and wings create dense concentric circles of pattern. Dragons are common mythical presences in the medieval Nordic world, chaotic and monstrous creatures often placed on the exterior of Nordic Christian spaces. As in this example, their long and curling bodies are often abstracted into elaborate decorative forms. The 4 dragons are interlocked, each biting their own tail. The composition is tight, and the carver has managed to render intense detail in the soft, easily chipped surface of the pine. These beings of natural chaos are active, dangerous, and claustrophobically contained, bound within the frames made by one another's bodies, caught in their own jaws and in the sharp grip of their companions. The upper roundel is bisected into 2 hemispheres. In the lower half, a knight on horseback slays a single dragon, vanquishing his foe in the spirit of Sigurd and St. George. While the narrative is legible, moving upwards from one event to the next, specific textual sources have not been pinned down. Through defeating a dragon, the depicted knight tames the kingly lion, much like the chivalric hero Ivan, who rescues a lion from a dragon in Chrétien de Troyes' romance. Like Ivan, the carved knight of the door then continues with this charismatic animal as his companion. The lion, a symbol of nobility and strength, is a king of the natural world, tamed and recruited to his new master's cause. Between the top and bottom of the upper roundel, the lion undergoes massive transformation through its three representations in the narrative. Below, he is caught in the curling tail of the dragon, his face contorted in ferocious fear. Above, the lion has joined the knight's party. Now collared, he follows the hero, locked in step with his master's horse. In the final scene of the upper roundel, the lion lies in prostrate grief on the grave of his fallen master. Now aged and emaciated, the lion does not return to another life, but like a loyal dog, starves at the knight's resting place in an act of ultimate faithfulness. Between the upper and lower halves of the roundel, the landscape is also transformed. Below, the scene writhes with action and with the vegetal markers of a wild place. The undulating, flowering vine that the dragon clings to is the largest example, but the curving ground line is also embellished with three other foliate elements, denoting the action as taking place within a woodland. Above, the knight and his companions are now in civilized space, and there is no vegetation whatsoever. In the place of the flowering tree, vine, and the dying dragon below, directly above is placed the grieving lion, and behind it is a remarkable rendering of a timber church. This carved church is the only extant representation of an Icelandic wooden church from the Middle Ages. When this object stood as the church door at Valjófstaðir, this small carved church endowed the door with a clever self-referentiality. In the narrative of the Valjófstaðir door, the Christian king who tames the creatures of the wild and the space of the woodland is narratively supplanted by the civilized space of the church. In this sense, the Valjófstaðir door tells a story of settlement by a Christian knight, of space remade and converted through human intervention. A story rendered in either reused driftwood or imported Norwegian pine is a bold tale of human mastery carved into the tenuous material realities of the medieval Icelandic landscape, which was in the beginning of a trajectory of deforestation, which would lead to severe land erosion and hardship up to the present day. The uncertainty of scarcity and of encroaching foreign rule was keenly felt in Commonwealth Iceland. Beneath the victory of the dragon, beneath the victory of the knight, the dragons of the lower roundel still writhe. Tack fyrir.
So much. Any questions?
As you know, I'm sure, one of the interesting features here of Icelandic Christianity, and possibly one of the reasons it was accepted so readily, is after the murders, is the fact that it continued to incorporate paganism, mythical elements, etc. So I find it really interesting that a Christian scene celebrating the saint would have still dragons and other mythical creatures there. Are you looking at that at all in your work?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. It's something that really drew me to this area of research because you've got this kind of negotiation of Christianity brought into local spaces. It is a tricky issue because the evidence that we have for these earlier belief systems is a little bit uncertain, because I'm saying that with Old Norse people in the audience, but what we have architecturally, what we have to really like pin down those earlier cultural markers is a little bit wiggly, and so it's something that I'm really interested in, but I definitely try to center myself in my own period of post-conversion, and just think about this interesting sort of enmeshment of multiple cultural forms that were all like relevant in the period. Like none of that stuff was just over. Like it continued to be really important.
Well, it may not be there in the three-dimensional, but the fact that the Asir, the Vanir, the Asir, Christianity could have been considered a polytheism, three-part God, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Mary had an important role, like Freya, etc. And so there are some scholars that believe that's part of the reason it was accepted here.
Yeah.
And you might want to, I don't know, you said you're doing archival research. So I think the three-dimensional stuff would be really good
Yeah,
compared to the
yeah.
black.
One thing that really interests me is the economic reasons that you might convert. It really just makes a lot of sense if you're trying to keep this relationship with the very Christianized Norwegian
Sure.
system. It's just a good idea. It's just good business.
All right, I think we're going to have to move on, unfortunately. So thank you. But before you go, these weren't set out this morning, so it was forgotten. So those of you who have already presented, when we do the break, we'll give you yours. There's your Fulbright Iceland water bottle.
Wow.
And your Fulbright pin. So, yes. So thank you so much for that. Next we have Olivia, who is a doctoral student in history, theory, and criticism of architectural program at MIT. So she's working on urban planning in the 20th century with a focus on the intersection of transportation, economic, and diplomatic policies, as well as infrastructure in the Arctic. So here in Iceland, Olivia has been looking at the role of infrastructure in NATO policies in the 50s and 60s, but let's let her tell us more.
Hello, thank you for giving me this platform to discuss my research. So, and it's, okay. My name is Olivia Houck, and I am finishing my 4th year of my PhD in architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So for the Fulbright, I explored the built environment in Iceland and by extension, the Arctic, through the research question, what is the instrumentality of the built environment in looking at the political, economic, and cultural dynamics of Iceland in the 20th century? I explored this question through 3 projects. First, an article in the Architectural Review, an online and print publication that features the Hlöðberg Artist Studio in Skarströnd. Second, an edited series for the Arctic Institute, a research-based think tank in Washington, D.C. on infrastructure in the Arctic. And third, an article investigating how the built and material environments elucidate the relationship between Iceland and NATO in the 1950s. With this latter article, I have the good fortune to present it at a workshop with some members of the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland in their monthly seminar. Through these projects, I found that in the financing, placement, construction, maintenance, and destruction of the built environment, it is a way to evaluate complex webs of concerns, capacities, intentions, and compromises. So for my first article, I conducted interviews and a site visit to the artist studio and residential house, Hlöðberg, built by the Oslo-based but partly Icelandic-run studio Bua. I traveled up the East Coast to Skarströnd in November, where I spent a day conducting formal analysis of the structure and speaking with the house's inhabitants and architects. The house, a renovated barn, is an innovative mix of old and new, light and dark, inside and outside, a study of juxtapositions, and, as the architects have clearly stated, an artistic interpretation of the Icelandic landscape and identity. To enter the building, one must step through the door of the sheep's house and make their way through the ruins of the animal pens. To stabilize the barn, a reinforced concrete raft was built within its walls before the construction of a 2-story timber structure, which is capped with a corrugated roof. The wooden box gives the impression that it was inserted into the original form. The second story is clad in alu zinc, reflecting the colors of the landscape and referencing the Icelandic tradition of covering buildings in corrugated metal as a way to protect them from the elements. This tradition started with the importation of corrugated steel cladding in the 1870s and was used on both timber and turf houses. The client's brief was to prioritize seeing through the house, an effect created by strategically placing new cuts and taking advantage of the barn's original apertures. Surrounded by tall grasses that can turn golden, violet, or emerald based on the season, the house frames views of the surrounding landscape. The openings are diamond cut, displaying the materials of the walls, a concoction of stone and gravel. The dark haptic concrete of the exterior is contrasted with the light, buoyant plywood paneling of the interior. The apertures and their careful framing of the landscape almost become canvases, operating in tandem with the artist's own work to feel like a gallery. Studio Bua has created a space that is bespoke to its inhabitants, but which remains rooted in environmental and cultural contexts. What I found most interesting is how the Icelandic environment and culture were interpreted through the structure, an approach that is the bedrock of my doctoral research. This project helped me to understand the conceptual framework of the built environment, not only as a means to tease apart material and financial processes, but also to explore more artistic expressions and interpretations of Icelandic identity. While this article focused on the close analysis of one structure, my edited series looks at the methodology itself of approaching the Arctic through the lens of infrastructure. For this series, I had the contributors explore the built environment, which, as I have argued, has complex geopolitical dimensions from its location and funding to its construction, ownership, and environmental impact. Infrastructure is a rich focal point for analysis. By interrogating structures and materials, we can see how actors perceive their relationship to the environment and to its inhabitants. Thus, it is a means through which to explore the dynamics of foreign policy, political intentions, strategic investment, economic and financial innovations, the ability to marshal and distribute resources, narratives about Arctic space, interactions with the environment, and technological developments. It frames complicated cultural, political, environmental, and economic stories through something very tangible and haptic. So this series asks, what can we learn from the hard bits? The 10 contributors consider a myriad of topics, from the viability of subsea cables to 19th century tourism in Norway to the usage of satellites for development in the region. So for my main project, I explored the relationship between Iceland and NATO in the 1950s and consulted internal documents from the NATO archive, as well as secondary sources, namely the work of Dr. Baldur Thralsson and Dr. Valur Ingimundarson. I found that the built environment factors into the relationship between Iceland and NATO in terms of both content and methodology. With regards to methodology, I argue that the core tensions in the NATO and Iceland security arrangement, such as the handling of classified materials and debates around the presence of US troops, can be investigated through the various iterations and considerations of built space. In terms of content, I argue that first, Iceland's deficiency in its security landscape is communicated by NATO representatives through a granular analysis of the storage facilities for sensitive materials. Second, due to the island's particular circumstances of not having a domestic military establishment and its particular economic situation at the time, Iceland's main contributions to the larger alliance's mutual defense is through the provision of facilities and land. And finally, the built environment is a way for NATO to project itself as a material and tangible presence, which is imperative at this particular time since the organization is so new. In the sense, the alliance is making itself real to itself, to its member nations, and to, in a more abstract concept, the Soviet Union. The documents show that, especially when Iceland was threatening to pull US troops out of the country in the mid-1950s, NATO saw both the permanent stationing of troops and the operations of its facilities as an active deterrent. So established in 1949, NATO spent the subsequent decade and beyond establishing the contours of its mission and operations, developing its organizational structure and administrative capacities, and articulating its scope and prerogatives. In the 1950s are this period of growth and development for the alliance. In the early years, the documents assess the importance of Iceland as a member of NATO and conceptualize how it actually fits into the alliance. NATO's interest in Iceland is spatial and material, based on its strategic location in the north and the necessity of military bases being stationed there. In 1950, and within documents that evaluate security concerns, Iceland is seen as having two prominent roles. First, it is the essential base in the North Atlantic for air operations, including the staging of aircraft to Europe. And second, is an essential link for the protection of the sea lines of communication, supporting naval operations and facilitating control of the North Atlantic. Along with the development of these bases, NATO's overarching objective is to preserve the integrity of the island as a home territory from both internal and external threats. In 1951, the security provisions in Iceland, from critical infrastructure to vetting procedures for personnel, are seen as fundamentally lacking. There is an absence of a security tradition, which translates into faulty physical arrangements that make it impossible, according to NATO representatives, for them to safeguard confidential and sensitive intelligence. A report entitled Security Check on Iceland on behalf of the North Atlantic Treaty breaks down the deficiency into granular detail, finding the physical conditions for the reception and storage of cosmic papers or NATO sensitive materials to be inadequate. The building, he reports, is not equipped with burglar alarms, nor is there a pass system in force. The papers, when not in use, are locked away in a strong room when the two existing keys are held by Mr. Jonsson. The NATO representatives' recommendations for ameliorating this project is equally as microscopic. that a combination lock should be obtained and fitted to the door of the strong room, which is at present fitted with a key lock of comparatively simple patterning. In conclusion, he states there's not the slightest chance of implementing the full cosmic system in Iceland, either now or at the foreseeable future. The physical security environment is mentioned again in another report about a year later. In it, they continue with their formal analysis of the physical space, recording that the offices hold the confidential materials are on the ground floor with unguarded windows, and that while the strong room is solidly constructed of concrete and stone, it doesn't fit within the NATO standards. And having only one key lock and 2 sets of keys, which are carried by the deputy minister and the cosmic control officer. So other concerns include the use of the incinerator, which is just fire, and then also the alarm system. The attention to detail of the report's observations and recommendations show the tangibility and the specificity of NATO's concerns, as well as its efforts to establish operations. Due to these conditions, Iceland would actually not receive a significant amount of classified materials for most of the 1950s, thus reflecting its larger hybrid relationship to the alliance. And there's actually a really funny or a lovely letter in like the late 1950s where they're saying, you know, we have like new concrete now, we have new doors, like we should get more classified information, and they end up actually succeeding in that. So perhaps the most important issue that Iceland and NATO face at this time is the debate around Iceland's contribution to the alliance and the US basing of troops on the island. As part of this agreement signed in May of 1951, Iceland, since it has no military establishment or budget, will provide free of charge the necessary land and other amenities required by the defense forces. They will also contribute on a fixed scale to the cost of civilian agencies and administrative costs. In conjunction with this assertion, a document is produced that assesses the material and built environment of Iceland, both in terms of military necessity and the development of the country. Of particular interest to me is the evaluation of a road network around Reykjavik and the southern regions of the island, and the recommendation for an eastern highway that would connect Reykjavik with Selfoss. The justification for this construction is based on military needs, in that it would support mass evacuation and troop movement. In these suggestions, they're conceptualizing Iceland as a threatened landscape, one that needs to prepare for an attack. Another interesting set of recommendations is the creation of plants for the production of cement and fertilizer. The cement factory is imperative, as the need for material is predicated to significantly increase, especially with regards to the construction of this highway, as well as aerodomes, air raid shelters, and harbor installations. Thus, there is a marrying of the economic and defensive concerns, and Iceland is concerning itself not only with the establishment of a troop presence, but with the facilitation of an industry that supports self-sufficiency. In a similar vein, the report supports the electrification efforts on the island and an increased use of water from the hot springs as a way of heating the houses. And so in all my research, I haven't seen NATO being connected to development projects such as this. So the US basing arrangement continues to be a tricky subject throughout the decade. As it mentioned explicitly in numerous documents, Iceland's main contribution to the mutual defense of the alliance is through the built environment. And in 1956, when Iceland was threatening to withdraw their support of the US troops in Iceland, facilities continued to be a really important focal point. In these discussions, the strategic importance of Iceland to the military alliance is reassessed, and it's found that the facilities continue to be a necessity. Citing the same factors from, there's no security forces still, and the same strategic interests of the Soviet Union. It comes out in these assessment documents that not only the troops, but the actual bases and facilities are seen, as the report states, as a physical deterrent. Quote, "It is the tangible and visible evidence of forces and installations in being, in place, and ready, which constitutes an effective deterrent, and it must be remembered that an effective deterrent is the greatest safeguard against the outbreak of war." So there's a dearth of scholarly analysis to begin with on NATO, but the material and built environmental history can provide us with very important information on the allocation and mobilization of resources, the efficacy of implementation of policy initiatives, and relationships of member nations to each other. In terms of this particular project, my next steps are to expand this analysis of the built and material culture to the larger Arctic, and investigate the development of particular projects in Iceland, Norway, and Greenland as a means to look at the conceptualizations in the 1950s and 60s of the Arctic as a space of threat, risk, and strategic operations. And so These projects have really underscored to me why Iceland is a really compelling place to study the intersection between politics, both foreign and domestic, and the built environment. And so in conclusion, I first want to deeply thank Belinda, Petter, and Petra for their incredible support this year. I also want to thank the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland and Dr. Max Conrad for hosting me. And finally, I want to thank my fellow Fulbright grantees for their vibrant conversations and wonderful friendship. And as an addendum, as a more personal note, I actually came to Iceland with a very different project. And after a couple of months in the archive, it just wasn't really fitting within the confines of my dissertation. And so in January and February, I spent those months really trying to figure out a new project. And it was actually on February 24th with the invasion of Ukraine when the efficacy of NATO was really thrust into the spotlight, and with our Fulbright excursion to the cemetery where we actually saw the military structures at Perlin, that I really started to think about the impact of NATO on the built environment in Iceland. And so this project, which I'm actually more excited about than my dissertation at the moment, would never have come about without actually being here on the ground and being supported by the Fulbright. And so not only did the Fulbright really help me produce scholarship, but it also generated new ideas. So thank you very much.
See if we have any questions. Is Bob gone? I was sure that he would have one. But I mean, can I just ask you sort of, so what's next for you? What are you doing when you leave Iceland?
So I'm actually going back to continue working on my dissertation, which has a little bit of a different bent. But this NATO research has actually spurred on 3 different articles. One about the construction of bomb shelters through NATO policy, focusing on the Reykjavik example. Second, on the built environment of Iceland, and third, on the NATO's Common Infrastructure Program, which is the first time that the word infrastructure is used in the Anglo-American context. And that's a way of looking at kind of military and defensive territory outside of the traditional nation-state paradigm. So yeah, I'll be in the US for that.
Okay.
Oh, and I'm also going to Sweden to do research in January, keeping the Arctic going.
Thanks again. And before you go, let's get you your Fulbright Iceland water, your Fulbright swag, the
Wonderful.
Fulbright Iceland water bottle, and the Fulbright pin.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have one more speaker before we take a little coffee break. And so we're going to hear from Eric Johnson, who's an archaeologist who came from us from the anthropology department of Harvard University, where he got his PhD shortly before taking up his grant. Eric is no stranger to Iceland, though, because I know that, especially the Skagafjörður area, because he spent many summers here. So like some of our previous grantees, he does have some time here in Iceland pre-Fulbright. But like our 2 previous speakers, Eric is hosted by the University of Iceland. So here you go. There we go.
Thank you, Belinda, and thank you to the Fulbright for hosting me this year and for today's talk. I feel grateful to be able to be going after both Robyn and Olivia, who've given us much context on the history of Iceland before and after the time period that I'm going to be talking about today, which is the 19th century. So when most people hear that I'm an archaeologist working in Iceland, they immediately think, oh, you must be digging Viking sites. And that's true to a certain extent. I have worked on the Viking Age in the past. But as the years have gone on, I have become more and more interested in less in the Viking Age and more in the era that immediately precedes the 20th century. And that is where we start to see a lot of elements of our modern society, our modern economy, elements of colonialism and the emergence of capitalism. It's in the 19th century in which many of these things begin to emerge. And the reason why I'm interested in Iceland to look at these topics is partly because of how unique it is as a place. At the Arctic edge of Europe, in northern, where I'm focusing this research is in the north, in Skagafjörður, in a context in which you have new ways of engaging with consumer goods in the 19th century. So I'll get to that in just a sec. But as Belinda noted, I've been here for, I can't remember, six summers between 2013 and 2017. And it's in that period in which many of the things I'm talking about today began to germinate. So this is an archaeology talk, so I will quickly give a picture of an artifact from 2015, which is actually my unedited and unorganized research notes from that time period. And you can see a lot of things that are going on in my head at the moment, a little unorganized, but we have things like capitalism, markets, farm abandonment, inequality, the relationship between the state and capital, the relationship between consumer goods and identity. And much of this doesn't actually make too much sense to the outside observer. But I just wanted to bring it up because it is here that a lot of the problems that I'm going to be talking about were first organized in my head. And specifically, if you look at the left-hand side here of this, this research diagram, you can see different types of data. And it's looking at those types of data that can help us get to these bigger questions about what does consumerism do here in Iceland? What is the effect of the consumer revolution? And what is the effect of the consumer revolution in relation to politics? But in order to get to those bigger questions, we need to have data that speak to those questions. And in Iceland, actually since 2015, luckily there has been a lot of research on this time period by archaeologists, especially at Houck. So articles peer-reviewed that have come out that look at the relationship between the economy and material culture in the 18th and 19th centuries here. A slew of articles, both by archaeologists and historians, that have really begun to see this period in a totally new light, including a couple of articles that I have published in the interim period. And this has brought to light a few main conclusions or sort of new frontiers of research about the 19th century. And that is, first of all, an argument against stagnation. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the early modern period, Iceland was under the Danish crown. And it's at this time that Denmark had an economic monopoly. So merchants, the only merchants that were legally allowed to trade in Iceland had to be of the Danish crown. And it's only after that point in the late 19th century that the monopoly begins to dissolve and you start to see changes. Well, recent research has started to argue against stagnation as a way of thinking about monopoly. So in the late 18th century, we see all kinds of changes that are happening on the ground. Even if you can't see these in national trade statistics, you can see emergent and new ways of engaging with consumption. So new goods that are coming into the household and changing how the household relates to material culture, things like coffee that start to change regimes of consumption in the home. And of course, along with coffee and tobacco and other, you have the pots and the plates and the cups and the smoking pipes for which to consume those goods. And they start to change how the Icelandic household engages in its daily routines. And then there's also some of this research that rethinks the production side of the consumption production equation. And that is more and more, Árni Daniel Júlisson's work most recently has looked at the early 19th century as a period of not stagnation, but economic growth that's largely spurred on by local farmers that are beginning to export more and more sheep at this time, as well as the fishing industry. So sort of seeing changes that most people thought were happening in the late 19th century Actually, these are happening much earlier, maybe not to the same scale. And so we're seeing a new picture, a new history, new economic history of Iceland here. But all of it is pointing to the importance of looking at things not just at the scale of national trade statistics, but a more regional approach, and one that incorporates multiple lines of evidence. So not just looking at trade statistics, but looking at probate records, looking at merchant ledgers, and looking at the archaeological record itself, things that weren't written down, but then remain in the household that can be excavated. So as I said, these are different ways of looking at the Icelandic economy at the time. And these are the things that have mostly been focused on by the archaeologists and historians that I mentioned earlier. What has been less researched is a source known as merchant trade ledgers. And that's the focus of my research, to sort of fit in this piece of the puzzle into a broader research program at this time. So on the left here, you can see an example of a merchant ledger from the 1880s. I think the next slide, and it's actually located, I'll situate us here. This ledger is coming from the Port of Hofsos, which is one of the most important trading posts going all the way back into the at least monopoly early modern period, which fed most of Skagafjörður, where I've worked over the years. And I'll also be mentioning a little later in the talk a port site called Grafarós, which was established in the mid to later 19th century, after the Danish trade monopoly period. And then we also see how close they are to Hólar, which is the bishop's seat in the north, the northern equivalent of Skálholt that we heard about earlier in Robyn's talk. So Hofsos, as I mentioned, largely held the Danish trade, largely was a monopoly site. So most of the Danish trade in the early modern and period was coming through Hofsos. But Grafarós is one of these sites that emerges after the dissolution of the trade monopoly. And you can see an aerial photograph of what the site looks like today, where it's now a set of ruins. And there are trade ledgers that I'm looking at from both of these sites to see how it is that we go, what changes about trade from the monopoly period into the more, say, free trade era. And these are two comparative sites. But the problem with trade ledgers is that they're often quite labor intensive to study. In order to extract summary data from these things, it can require a lot of intensive transcription work, and most of it actually in Danish, a bit of Danish, a bit of Icelandic, and you never know what the handwriting is going to be like. And of course, they have this, in some case, I mean, the logic of the ledger is relatively simple once you learn some basic rules, but it can be overwhelming at first. We have on the left side the debit column, and on the right side the credit column. So it's not like people are coming to the store with cash and buying goods like we would today. These are running credit and debit entries that take place over the course of a year. So at the top we have Björn Jönsson from Gröf, which was right near actually Grafarós. And we can see at various points in the year he comes to the store to buy whatever it may be, if that's in some case coffee or sugar. And then on the right side you have, or rye. On the right side we have then what he's bringing to sell, basically. And that can be fish in some cases, or sheep, or wool. So we can, if you read on the surface here, there's a lot of words and numbers, but if you can reconstruct those, you can actually reconstruct the microeconomy of this region by looking kind of behind the ledger and envisioning what people are actually doing with the goods that they're purchasing and with the things that they're selling. But like I said, this is very labor intensive to study. And one could do a micro-analysis of just a few pages of this and learn lots about it. But as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a gap in research right now at the regional scale. And so to look at an entire region and try to kind of examine the flow of goods and the flow of value is one of the goals of this project. So to do that, I've engaged with a machine learning software platform that allows for the transcription of handwritten documents at a much faster pace than if but totally by hand. And so I'm going to go into a bit of for those of you who are less interested in machine learning and the data engineering, feel free to zone out here for a minute or two. But for those who are interested, the way that the workflow for this year has been to take photographs of documents, of every page of a set of merchant ledgers, to upload those to a server, and to add some metadata to each of those pages, and then to create a database structure that can then receive the data that's coming from this, whether that's the book or the entry or the transaction or the actual individual items that are being purchased. What farm are they coming for? That you could also add people who are purchasing these to be able to track these variables over time and space. And then once these photos are uploaded and the database has been constructed, I've been doing first a layout analysis using a software called Transcribus, which is an open source AI-powered text recognition software. I recommend it for any historians that are looking to do a massive amount of transcription in a relatively short amount of time. I've found I've had some luck. There are some trade-offs. So there's been some things that it does really well, but other things it does poorly. And I could talk about more of that if you'd like. But in short, the software can recognize what is text and what is not text. You do have to tell it, in this case, since this is a table and not, say, like a letter someone is writing, you do have to tell it what elements of the table are, how the table is organized. But once you've done that, it can recognize the text and then spit out a transcription of that text. You tell it what language it is. And some other researchers have already created a 19th century Danish algorithm that can recognize at least some of this text. But I've built off of that algorithm and created a hybrid Danish-Icelandic transcription model at the moment. And for now, it's working relatively well. As I'd say, it's a little bit like having a research assistant who's in their first week and perpetually in their first week of work. So it often will misspell things. It'll often misrecognize words. And especially with these ledgers, you have all kinds of things that aren't exactly words, but are little marks, little check marks or circles or percentages or fractions and things like that, all of which is really important and needs to be put into the database, but the text recognition isn't so good at recognizing. So I find myself not working as quickly as I would have liked, but it is still a lot less work than it would have been otherwise. And it mostly comes down to being an editor of already transcribed data rather than a transcriber itself. So once that has been transcribed, we clean up the data and get ready to import it into the database, into this section of the database here. This is basically the Excel version of what that ledger looks like when it's all cleaned up. Where we have name of the item, how much it costs, the quantity of it, and the price. And from there, given the fact that these are all in these ledgers tied to specific farms, we can import this into GIS for spatial analysis and then begin to run queries. So what I'm about to show are some very, very preliminary results. I still have a few months here left in Iceland, I guess a couple now, to continue this work. But these are what the final product will hopefully look like. And that is basically the ability to query this database and then look at trends in purchasing patterns over space and time. So we have each of these farms. This is at least for 1 year. And you can see different types of goods that are being bought, whether that's sugar or salt or coffee or wheat, rye, and the different percentages from household to household. And you might be able to then make sense of trends at a regional scale. That's been a problem with previous research up until now. Another way you could represent some of this data and ask questions about it over space is to say, this map actually has two variables. The first is the total amount of Danish kroner that's spent at the store for the year. That's the color. So yellow is the less money that's spent at the shop, and red is more money spent at the shop. And then we have a second variable, which is the household size, the size of, so because if you have more people living at the farm, presumably you have to buy more goods for that household. And so small is a small household and large is a large household. And you can see here too that there's a general trend between the amount that is purchased at the store and the size of the household, which we would expect. But there are also some cases that are outliers. If we look at the site of Wynne up here, it is a small household, but it is actually spending a lot of money. And so that then gives us a clue into, well, maybe there's something different going on at that individual farm relative to the surrounding region. So this will hopefully then be like a backdrop, a kind of a framework for how to structure an archaeological survey. So if we look at the site Wynne here today, it's an abandoned farm in this valley where we have a little bit of a green patch and a little bit of a mound in the back valley here where there was originally like a turf house. And we could do some test excavations at this location to see how the archaeological record corresponds or doesn't with the historical data. So all of this is to say the articles that I showed at the beginning of the talk are all written by people that are just working down the hall from me at Iceland. And I have to say, being here, as Olivia mentioned in her talk, has been one of the most rewarding things about the work. And this has basically allowed me to walk down the hall and have conversations with people that are studying very similar topics. And this has really come to a head where we've decided to collaborate on a potential research proposal. This isn't a final version or anything like that, but it uses some of the database engineering that I've done and some of the transcription platform to contribute, contribute to a future RANIS proposal, which is an Icelandic research grant agency. So that is a future project. Oh no, something's happening. It's okay. A future project that this work really can contribute to in one way or another. So very briefly, my favorite things about being here. The first thing, of course, is getting married to my partner, Fika. This is us at the Sysselmaður in Kopenhagen, and of course, traveling around the country. The fall here, I've never been here in the fall, and the colors were just outstanding. And we're bad at taking selfies, but we can take pictures of each other as we go for hikes. And of course, in living in Reykjavik, we have plenty of cats. Venus, who's a bit of a diva around the block from us, and we don't know the name of the other one, but we've been calling them Pippin. And finally, a lot of textile crafts. I'm not taking credit for this. This is actually Fika's work here. All of this handmade. If you see me walking around with anything, any kind of knitwear object, it is likely handmade by her. A lot of things are expensive here, but yarn is not, at least Icelandic yarn is not. And then, of course, the traffic has been one of our favorite things about the landscape. So thank you so much. And I'll just reiterate what everyone else has said so far. This has been a really life-changing opportunity to be here for this year. So thank you.
A couple of minutes.
Okay, just asking about some of the text recognition stuff that you've been doing.
Yes.
You said that you generated your own algorithm for kind of bridging the gap between Danish and Icelandic. Was that using like XGBoosts, or was that built within the Inscriptus system?
Through Transcribus, you can use a pre-existing model.
Okay, cool.
To base to base a new model off of. So that's how this algorithm was built.
Okay, cool. And then you like built a SQL database or something.
And then, a SQL database to separate
Cool.
to put all that
All right,
information.
thanks.
Okay, thank you again so much.
Oh, there's another
Oh,
question?
there
Yeah.
was another question.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. I know this wasn't the focus because it's more in the future, but I'm really curious if you did get to do a dig in an area, what would you be looking for?
Mhm.
I have some ideas, but I'd be interested to know what
Yeah.
you have in mind.
A lot of consumer goods like coffee and sugar and wheat is mostly what's being purchased. They don't preserve well in the archaeological record, but the things that would have been used with those objects, like pottery, so new ceramics that are coming in as imports from Europe, pipe stems, these types of things, glass, window glass that starts to become more common in this period, and then trying to compare that at a regional scale. So which households have more of those types of goods? Are there different, like, is there variation between from household to household that might also be reflected in the ledgers as well? So does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's just the mind boggles at the
Mhm.
options. For example, what if that one farm,
Mhm.
it's the small red circle,
Yeah.
was kind of further into the valley.
Yes.
So what if they are hoarding stuff to kind of trade, barter further up the valley or something? Or, I'm just trying to figure out, how do you put kind of conclusive limitations, or is it just open and see?
Well, there's all kinds of stuff that isn't getting recorded in the ledger. That's more like informal economies, so trade that's happening that doesn't get written down. And hopefully archaeology can capture some of that, right? So if you come at it from all different angles, you're not necessarily getting the truth, but you can get closer to that reality.
Absolutely. Did you want to say something? No.
I was just kind of curious, did any new locations appear that like you had not thought of wanting to explore and said, oh, based on my data now, I want to go here that I didn't before?
Well, you check back with me in a couple of weeks, because I'm going to be running the numbers again to see which sites are going to be most interesting to survey this summer. But Freund had always been on my list as, oh, this is a nice, interesting. There's archaeological factors. Okay, is it well preserved? Is there a modern farm on top of it, or is it abandoned? And so you're constrained in some ways by that. And Freund had been on my list of places to visit, but there's probably more that I had never would have thought of that this ledger will speak to. Yeah, but like I said, check back in a couple of weeks.
All right, well, we can continue to chat with Eric and the other speakers during the coffee break. Let's give him another round of applause. Here's your water bottle and your pen, your Fulbright swag. Thank you so much. So everybody, what we're going to do now is take a little coffee break. We're going to start punctually at the odd time of 2:25, but I think so. Petra, is the fruit coming here? It's okay. So it was supposed to be here at 2, so it should be here. Yeah, so we're just having a little fruit break. And for those of you who aren't here in person, maybe you can grab a snack wherever you are, and see you back here in about 20 minutes.